The Wuhan Tiandi project has a lot of different heights of buildings throughout. So why vary the height so much? What does that accomplish?
Good question. In fact, this is kind of unusual, right, for China, where
Yeah.
buildings, especially residential buildings, tend to be all the same heights and they all face the same direction because of preference for sunlight and also regulations. But, in fact, kind of Wuhan Tiandi is so different because it has different heights. We want to create because variety and, sense of sort of diversity is very important in creating a identity, but also visual interest. So Wuhan Tiandi, we use different heights to kind of try to moderate the impact of density. It is very high, but also compose it so that you have nice spacing to allow sunlight, breeze, and all that together. In fact, it's one of those principles that we use a lot in designing cities. And in the skyline, I call that it's almost like a forest. So in forests, you have this undergrowth. But for us, we're like pedestrian scale building, 2-3 stories to 5-6 stories, podium that defines our experience on the street. Then there are a lot of tall buildings, which I call that undergrowth. And then there were a few taller buildings that mark each district that may be different. And there's the landmark building is super high, right? Like the John Hancock here or Jingmao Tower in Shanghai. They are like the iconic for the city, so that we call that the giants in the forest.
Like the redwoods or something.
That's right. And then every now and then you have some special buildings that make the city very special. So I think we're just applying the same theory to Wuhan Tiandi.
It's interesting because, like you said, it's still dense. And I imagine it's still delivering return on investment for the developer and the people that are funding the project. So
right.
How do you balance, what design principles help you balance those seemingly competing needs? Because it seems like density and open space, or the feeling of crowded, and the feeling of having enough space, it's kind of at odds with each other. But you're saying you can do it all.
Yeah, I think this is the art of what we do, right? How do you, especially private project, they do need to generate return on investment, but even public sector project. Most projects, they need to have some financial or real estate value. But what we try to do is leverage these investments to create public benefit. Because if it's no good for the city, there's no point doing it. But you do have to leverage the benefit you generate from real estate values, so it will regenerate part of the city. Maybe it will create some amenities like public open spaces that is not there. Maybe even historic preservation, which Wuhan Tiandi is something very special about that. Yeah. And then talk about density, though. It's also very important because, especially for places like China, if we don't build enough density, the city will continue to sprawl. Right. I shared earlier this morning, in 10 years, they got 211 million more urban population, which is equivalent to 78 Chicago. So if we all build them low density, we'll have to build a lot more.
2/3 of the United States.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So you mentioned historic preservation. Tell us about that. There were several historic buildings on site, right? And many of them are being retained.
Right.
How and what sort of site did you come to?
It's very interesting because the historic building on site, they're not necessarily like the historical gems in terms of architecture gem, but they are special. They came from this early sort of 19th century kind of trading post industrial time of Wuhan. But then there are other historical buildings that just represent that period. And we thought it worked really well for these retail food and beverage centers that they have. But the key is we wanted to make connection to history. And then so to do that, then you put that areas and work together. And then that brings another thing is how do you kind of create an interesting historical preservation area and do not create a museum. Some projects are more suitable for museum, but how do you balance preservation and then still adapt for the future need and then to make it vibrant and useful? That's like the art, and it really needs not only our designer's role, but also working really closely with governments and also the developer. What are the future needs, and then how do you preserve the character? In the Wuhan Tiandi, we even preserve trees.
Old trees.
Yeah, old trees, and then the trees and building really come together, very special. So
it's interesting because the point of preserving those older elements or the historic elements, part of it would be to preserve that intimacy that those low scale buildings and trees and open space. There's a reason that kind of design persists. People still like it, and they liked it hundreds of years ago or thousands of years in other sites cases. But how do you recreate that when you're also putting in all this new context, when you're putting in new tall towers, when the population is so much larger? Can you preserve that kind of intimacy by preserving the building, or do you have to do something to recreate it?
yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's a challenge that we constantly face as city designers. I think in Wuhan Tiandi space, we decided that where the historical buildings are, the new infills will be compatible in scale. In height and in the kind of texture of the building, even like the finish of the building is very similar. So that kind of enhanced the district because there weren't that many buildings that is preserved. But when it comes together, it kind of reads like a cohesive whole. But then when you go into the new areas, then it becomes how do we design like different scales that will extend the kind of intimate scale. So in that case, we had lower residential buildings, and unlike most Chinese housing projects, it would just be the same towers 30 times across, right? So this one, we actually had lower scale buildings that will kind of transition from the historical context, but it's also good for our human scale. And then with that, sort of defines the courtyard, and then you put in the towers. And even at the base of the towers, we make sure there is something that is at our scale to make it friendly. And then there are many other things like the open spaces are, at a more intimate scale. And the project did not strike out to build the largest open space that we have, but to think about human scale in a lot of things to do that we are doing. So
I'm thinking earlier you said it was like some sort of principles that you use to plan a city. Those are the same principles that you use to plan this project. And in a lot of Chinese cities, you're planning on a scale of a mega block or something much larger than maybe an older city would have available. So what sort of principles do you think can apply to different contexts where you don't have that massive area where you can say we want space over here and we want tall buildings and we need this transition area? I mean, maybe those things just need to be negotiated on an urban planning scale, through public debate and stuff. But do you think it's possible to apply that kind of thinking to cities where you don't have such large scale redevelopment?
in fact, I think that cities with large scale development is the most challenging one, that you want to maintain the kind of intimate pedestrian scale. In particular, those very fast developing cities or countries like China, there's a lot. I'm quite familiar with Southeast Asia. So developers will come around. They do not have infill projects like we have. We have a block or 2 blocks redevelopment. They have just, 10 hectares, 100 hectares, and it's only one project. Then, how do you guide and use a good planning principle that works for a successful kind of mature downtown? A mature city doesn't have to be downtown into this new area. And then, so we often have to, how do you call it? It's partial negotiation, partial education, and how do you create sort of fine-grained streets, small blocks? Because the project may be very big, but we are about the same height, and our experience with space is about the same. So how do you do that in fine-grained things? Have hierarchy. Some places are really big for special celebrations. Some spaces are intimately scaled for residential or a downtown plaza. Different things to create the diversity. And I think besides the scale, the speed that has to get things done is also a challenge, because very often developer was like, okay, if this works, why don't you just do 10 of those?
Yeah.
Or maybe we'll change the color. So how do we, so we often have to showcase like, no, cities are more complex, so that you are building a city now with the size of site you have, and we're not building a project. So I think those are the more challenging ones. Down sort of existing cities, infill sites, much easier to do because the framework is already there, and the opportunity to amalgamate and make it too much bigger is not there. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.